In the winter of 1781, a British officer named Banastre Tarleton was chasing a man he was certain he had already beaten. Tarleton was 26 years old, aggressive and merciless. He had built his reputation by running down, retreating Americans and cutting them apart before they could turn and fight. His men called him Bloody Ban. The Americans called him something worse. And in early January, Lord Cornwallis handed him a simple job: find Daniel Morgan's ragged little army in the backcountry of South Carolina and destroy it before it could do any more damage. Tarleton had every reason to believe he would succeed. He had over 1,000 men, including his own British Legion, some of the best light cavalry in the entire British Army. Morgan had roughly the same number, but most of them were militia Euro farmers and hunters with no standing army training. The kind of men who had broken and run in nearly every major battle of the war so far. On paper, this was not a fair fight. 12 days later, Tarleton's command would cease to exist as a fighting force, and the story of how that happened starts more than 25 years earlier, on a dirt road in Pennsylvania, with a teenage wagon driver and a British lieutenant who made the worst decision of his career. In 1755, 17-year-old Daniel Morgan was working as a teamster hauling supplies for General Edward Braddock's doomed campaign against Fort Duquesne. Morgan was big, strong, and did not take orders well from men he did not respect. During an argument, a British lieutenant struck him with the flat of his sword. Morgan knocked the officer flat with one punch. For that, a military court sentenced him to 500 lashes €, a punishment that killed weaker men outright. Morgan was tied to a wagon wheel and whipped in front of the camp. According to the story he told for the rest of his life, the drummer miscounted, and Morgan only received 499. He used to joke that the British still owed him one. He survived. He carried the scars on his back for the next 47 years, and he carried something else, €2, a permanent, personal hatred of the British Army and everything it stood for. That hatred would outlast the war itself. By the time the Revolution broke out in 1775, Morgan was a Virginia farmer with a reputation as one of the best woodsmen and marksmen on the frontier. He raised a company of riflemen and marched them 600 miles to Boston in 3 weeks flat, a pace that stunned Continental officers used to militia, who wandered in whenever they felt like it. He fought in the brutal failed assault on Quebec, was captured, and spent months as a prisoner before being exchanged. 2 years later, at Saratoga in 1777 still 4 years before Cowpens his riflemen picked off British officers from the tree line with a precision that terrified the entire enemy command structure. One of his men, Timothy Murphy, is credited with killing British General Simon Fraser at a range most soldiers of the era could not have imagined possible. It was not the battle that made his name. It was the proof that made Congress trust him with one. Morgan had proven himself in some of the most important engagements of the war. And then Congress did to him exactly what it had done to other men who deserved better. In 1779, passed over for promotion in favor of officers with less combat experience and more political connections, and worn down by chronic sciatica that left him barely able to sit a horse, Morgan resigned his commission and went home to his farm in Virginia. He assumed his fighting days were over. Then the war in the South collapsed. Charleston fell. Horatio Gates, the same general who had taken credit for Morgan's work at Saratoga, marched an American army into catastrophe at Camden and watched it disintegrate. Cornwallis was rolling north with almost nothing standing in his way. Nathaniel Greene, the new commander of the Southern Department, needed every capable officer he could find, and there was only one name on his list who had actually beaten the British in the field. Greene called Morgan back, gave him roughly 600 men, and sent him west to threaten British supply lines. Cornwallis sent Tarleton to erase him. By mid-January, Tarleton was closing fast, and Morgan made a decision that horrified some of his own officers. He chose to make his stand at a place called Cowpens, an open cow pasture with a river at his back, and no easy line of retreat. Every rule of conventional warfare said this was suicide. Morgan understood something his officers did not. His militia would not stand and fight a bayonet charge no matter what he told them. So instead of pretending they would, he built his entire battle plan around the fact that they would not. He organized his army in 3 lines: deep instead of wide. Up front, a thin screen of sharpshooters ordered to fire once and fall back. Directly behind them, the main militia line, a Euro, the same farmers and hunters, just one step further back, a Euro, told to fire twice and then fall back themselves, on command, not in panic. Behind them, his Continental regulars, the only troops expected to hold their ground completely, and, hidden behind a low rise at the very back, William Washington's cavalry, waiting. On the night before the battle, Morgan walked from campfire to campfire, sat with the militia, and told them exactly what he needed from them. 1 or 2 shots, a Euro, that was all, depending on which line you were standing in. A Euro, aimed at the officers, and then walk away, and nobody would call it running. He was not asking farmers to become soldiers overnight. He was asking them to do one specific thing he knew they could actually do. On the morning of the 17th of January 1781, Tarleton did exactly what Morgan expected him to do. Confident and furious that Morgan had somehow chosen ground with no retreat, he ordered an immediate frontal assault without resting his exhausted men, who had marched most of the night to catch up. The sharpshooters fired their one shot and fell back, just as planned. Then the militia line behind them fired their 2 shots and withdrew in order, exactly as planned. From where Tarleton sat, it looked like the same collapse he had seen from American militia a dozen times before. A Euro, first one line breaking, then the next. He ordered his men to press the pursuit, and his formation began to come apart at the seams from its own momentum. That was the moment Morgan had built the entire battle around. The Continental regulars held their ground and delivered a volley into the disorganized British line at close range. William Washington's cavalry swept out from behind the hill and slammed into Tarleton's flank. The militia, who had fallen back in order rather than fled in panic, reformed and came back into the fight from the side. In less than an hour, Tarleton's command was surrounded on 3 sides with nowhere left to go. The numbers from Cowpens are almost unbelievable. British losses were around 110 killed and over 800 captured. American losses were roughly 25 killed and 60 wounded. Tarleton's British Legion, one of the most feared units in the entire war, was effectively destroyed in a single morning. Tarleton himself barely escaped, fleeing the field with a handful of surviving cavalry, while the rest of his command surrendered behind him. Cornwallis never recovered the men or the momentum he lost that morning. He turned north in a punishing chase after Greene that wore his army down mile by mile, a campaign that ended 8 months later with his surrender at Yorktown. Without Cowpens, there is no exhausted march north. Without the exhausted march north, there is no trap at Yorktown. A battle fought by farmers who had been told to run away twice and then hold once changed the entire trajectory of the war in the South. Here is something worth sitting with. Morgan and Tarleton were, in a strange way, mirror images of each other. Both were aggressive, both were brilliant tacticians in their own style, and both had built their reputations on speed and audacity. But Tarleton's aggression came from arrogance, a Euro, a belief that the enemy in front of him was already beaten before the first shot was fired. Morgan's came from something harder and colder, forged on a wagon wheel 25 years earlier. One man trusted his reputation, the other man trusted his plan. At Cowpens, the plan won. Daniel Morgan's sciatica caught up with him again just weeks after Cowpens, and he went home to Virginia believing, once more, that he was finished. He came out of retirement one final time in 1794 to help suppress the Whiskey Rebellion, then served a single term in Congress before his health gave out for good. He died in 1802, 70 years old, still carrying the scars from a Pennsylvania wagon road and a lieutenant who never learned his name. If you made it this far, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like on this video and let me know in the comments which overlooked battle you think deserves its own deep dive.